If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The road stretched across the frontier province in long coils of dust and stone. The late summer heat pressed down without relief, and the air shimmered above the dry ground. A Roman legionary walked at the head of a small supply cart, his boots grinding the soil, the weight of his armor clinking with each step. His name was Marcus Aelius Varro, a soldier in his mid-30s, hardened by over a decade of service in distant campaigns. His duties now were less glorious, escorting food, tools, and equipment to an isolated garrison near the edge of Roman-held territory. It was the kind of task assigned to men no longer trusted for frontline command, but still too valuable to dismiss. Behind the cart followed a young woman, no more than 20, a slave assigned by the quartermaster to assist. She had no recorded name in the rolls. In the camp, she was called Puella Serva, the slave girl. Thin, sunburnt, and scarred, she was property taken years earlier during a raid in one of the rebellious provinces. Her tasks were menial, hauling, cleaning, cooking when ordered, and she spoke little, not out of modesty, but because silence was often safer. The journey had already drained them both. The horse pulling the cart had been weakening for days. Marcus had noticed the tremor in its legs, the way its breath rattled at night, but he had no replacement. The garrison expected supplies, and turning back was not an option. When the animal stumbled again, Marcus tightened his grip on the reins and muttered a curse. He glanced at the girl, who kept her eyes low, her face streaked with dust. Then, with a final shudder, the horse collapsed. Its body hit the road with a dull thud. The cart lurched to a stop, the wheels sinking into the dirt. Marcus dropped the reins and crouched beside the animal. He pressed his hand to its neck, felt the faint pulse fade, and let out a breath that was closer to a growl. For a moment, he simply knelt there, his thoughts circling. Without the horse, the supplies could not move. If he abandoned the cart, he would face punishment at the garrison. If he tried to haul it himself, he would last only a few miles. The girl stood a few paces back, her posture tense. She had seen soldiers curse and whip slaves for less, and part of her brace for the sting of anger. But Marcus did not raise his voice. He rubbed his hand across his forehead, sweat streaking the grime on his skin. In his mind, images of past campaigns surfaced, men dying in mud, wagons overturned, comrades lost because someone faltered. Responsibility weighed heavier than the armor on his shoulders. When he finally rose, his decision was cold and practical. He would cut free what he could carry and leave the rest. His hand reached for his dagger, prepared to slice through the leather straps that held the supplies. That was when the girl moved. Without speaking, she stepped forward, bent her knees, and pressed herself into the dust. Her fingers, already raw from the road, closed around the thick rope. She looped it across her shoulders and arms, then pulled. The cart shifted an inch. She adjusted her grip, leaned forward again, and dragged it farther, her knees grinding against the gravel. Marcus froze. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. He had seen cruelty before, slaves beaten, driven like animals, but this was not a command. No one ordered her. She chose it. And still, it disturbed him. Her body was frail, her arms too thin, her scars old but visible. Each movement looked like it might break her. He felt a twinge of something he had not felt on campaign, unease. His mind calculated the risk. Yes, she could drag it slowly. Yes, it might be enough to reach the next village. But beneath that calculation, another thought intruded. She was suffering for his duty. His instinct, drilled from years as a soldier, was to let her continue. But a second instinct, quieter yet stubborn, told him to step in. His hand lifted, hovering near the rope, but he did not pull it from her. Instead, he walked beside her. His face betrayed little, but inside he wrestled with the choice. He could stop her and lose the supplies, or let her degrade herself, crawl like a beast, and perhaps keep both of them alive. His jaw tightened. For now, he chose silence. As they moved together down the endless road, her body bent, his steps measured. Both carried thoughts they did not speak. She feared collapse, feared his anger if she failed, but also feared vanishing into worthlessness again if she did not try. He, on the other hand, felt the sharp press of doubt against the hardened wall of discipline. This was no way for either of them to live, yet here they were, bound by necessity, dust, and the road ahead. The sun began to sink lower as the road wound into uneven ground. The cart creaked under the strain, its wheels grinding over stones, and the girl's knees left faint streaks of blood where the skin tore open against the dirt. Marcus walked at her side, silent but restless, his eyes fixed on the horizon and then back to her hunched form. In the first hours after the horse's collapse, he had convinced himself that this was temporary, that she would endure until they reached the next settlement where another animal might be purchased. Yet with each mile, that conviction grew weaker. He watched her shoulders tremble under the ropes, the way her breath came in shallow gasps, and he began to wonder not only how long she could survive this pace, but whether he was willing to let her destroy herself for the sake of duty. By the time night fell, they reached a stretch of forest where the road widened slightly. Marcus called halt. The girl released the rope with fingers stiff from strain and collapsed on her side, dust clinging to her sweat-soaked skin. He crouched down, opened the leather flask, and pressed it into her hands before drinking himself. She looked up at him, hesitant, as if uncertain whether she was allowed to take more than a sip. He gave a curt nod, and she drained it slowly, water spilling down her chin. He turned his gaze away, unsettled by how fragile she appeared, yet also by the stubborn resolve he had seen in her eyes when she chose to pull the cart. That night, as they built a fire with fallen branches, Marcus' thoughts grew heavier. His orders from the garrison were clear: deliver the supplies. The cart contained rations, replacement sandals, spare pila, even letters to officers stationed ahead. Abandoning it would mean disobedience and punishment. But the girl was no tool. He had seen tools break. She was flesh and bone, and if she failed, he would still be left with the same impossible weight to carry. He considered binding the cart with ropes so he could drag it himself, but one look at the raw cuts on his palms told him it was foolish. He also thought briefly of seeking help, yet there were no villages marked on this stretch of the frontier. They were alone. His decision, then, had been no real decision at all. Keep walking, let her carry what he could not. Still, guilt pressed at the back of his mind. She, too, lay awake that night by the fire. For her, silence had always been a shield. In the camps, slaves who spoke too freely earned lashes, while those who bent quietly to work often went unnoticed. But here, out on the road with only one man beside her, silence carried weight of another kind. She had seen him hesitate when the horse fell, seen the way his hand had hovered near the rope. That hesitation unsettled her more than a blow would have. A blow was predictable. His restraint was not. She wondered if he pitied her, or if he merely calculated how much she could endure before breaking. The question stayed with her long after he had closed his eyes. At dawn, Marcus rose first, tightening the straps of his armor, his body aching from the hard ground. He cut strips of leather from the horse's harness and fashioned them into broader straps for the cart, fitting them so the girl could pull standing instead of crawling. She watched him work without speaking, unsure if this was an act of mercy or efficiency. When he gestured for her to try, she slipped the straps over her shoulders. The cart shifted forward, easier than before, though still crushing in its weight. Her eyes flicked up to his, searching for his intent. He gave no explanation, only a short command: move. As the road wound on, villagers finally appeared at a distance, working in fields along the edge of the forest. They looked up as the pair passed by, a legionary, dusty and stern, and a slave girl straining under a cart like a beast of burden. Some frowned, others whispered among themselves, but no one offered aid. The girl lowered her eyes, shame pressing into her chest, but Marcus kept his gaze straight ahead, jaw locked. He would not explain himself to strangers. Yet inside, he wondered if they saw the same thing he did. Not an animal, but a young woman whose endurance was far beyond what her body should allow. When they camped again that night, she quietly mended his sandal strap with thread pulled from her own garment. Marcus watched her fingers work in the firelight, quick and practiced, and for the first time in years he spoke without command in his voice. "Where are you from?" His tone was flat, not curious, but she froze as if caught in a trap. After a moment, she answered softly, "A village far beyond the Danube, burned when she was a child." She did not look up, and he did not press her further. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried with it a weight both of them could feel. Two lives pulled into the same road by war and circumstance, neither certain what the next mile would bring. The forest grew denser as the road narrowed, and the ground shifted from dust to mud. The cart wheels sank with each turn, forcing the girl to lean harder into the straps. Her breath came ragged, her feet slipped in the muck, and several times the cart threatened to tip. Marcus steadied it with a shoulder, his palms grinding into the wood until splinters lodged beneath the skin. They advanced by inches, every step earned. Neither spoke, yet the silence between them was filled with strain. The scrape of the cart, the hiss of her breath, the low grunt of his effort. When she stumbled and fell to her knees, Marcus reached out without hesitation, gripping her forearm and hauling her upright. His hand lingered for a moment, firm and steady, before he released her. "Stand," he said, voice low, more instruction than command. She obeyed, not because she feared him, but because she knew the supplies mattered. The garrison would not survive without them, and if she collapsed, he would fail his duty. That thought pressed against her mind with the same weight as the straps biting into her shoulders. As night approached, they stopped near a clearing where a small stream cut through the earth. Marcus removed his helmet, knelt, and plunged his hands into the water, watching blood swirl from the cuts across his palms. The girl followed, cupping her hands to drink before rinsing the raw skin on her knees. She expected him to order her away, but he did not. Instead, he tore a strip from his undershirt and bound his hand. When she reached for another strip of cloth from her own garment, offering it silently for her knees, he accepted it without comment and tied it around her legs with surprising care, his fingers rough but precise. The fire that night burned low. They shared the last of the hard bread, Marcus dividing it evenly between them. He could have taken more. He was stronger, his body demanded it, but he cut it fairly. She studied him through the flicker of flame, her thoughts unsettled. He had not struck her once, not shouted, not treated her as the soldiers in camp had. Still, she did not trust him. Trust was dangerous. Yet part of her, buried deep, wanted to believe he was different. Marcus, for his part, found himself watching her more closely than he intended. She was thin, scarred, her body marked by years of hardship, yet she endured. Each time she staggered, she forced herself up again. Her silence reminded him of himself after campaigns in Germania, how he had stopped speaking of the men buried in shallow graves, of the villages burned because orders demanded it. He wondered how old she had been when she was taken, what she had lost, but he did not ask. It was enough to know she carried burdens of her own. At dawn, they continued. The road opened onto a ridge where they could see farmland below, patches of wheat, smoke rising from cottages, and villagers moving between fields. For the first time in days, the girl slowed, her eyes fixed on the sight of families working together, children running barefoot in the dirt. Her face tightened, not in envy, but in a kind of quiet grief. Marcus noticed, and for a brief moment, he understood what she was seeing, what she once had, or what she never would. The villagers saw them too, a legionary walking beside a slave girl bent to a cart. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to invite trouble. Others whispered, their expressions caught between pity and disgust. One old man spat into the dirt as they passed. Marcus felt the heat of shame rise in his chest, though he showed nothing on his face. To them, he was a Roman soldier, and she was property. But to him, in that moment, the image was harder to accept. He tightened his grip on his sword hilt, not in threat, but in restraint. He would not justify himself to strangers. That evening, when they made camp beyond the fields, Marcus took time to check the cart. The straps he had cut from the harness were holding, but the wheels were worn. They would crack from strain. If one broke, They would have no chance of reaching the garrison in time. He ran a hand along the rim, frustration biting at him. She sat nearby, mending the leather of his belt with the same calm precision she had shown with his sandals. He caught himself staring, then forced his eyes away. Breaking the silence, he asked, "Do you understand why this cart matters?" His tone was serious, his voice heavy with the weight of duty. She hesitated, unsure if it was a question or a trap, then nodded. "Supplies," she said softly. "For soldiers." He studied her expression, searching for deceit, but found none. For the first time, he explained more than necessary. "Yes, and without them, men will starve, and men who starve do not hold walls." It was not a confession, not trust, but it was an answer, and it told her something about him, that he was not carrying this burden for himself, but for others. The fire burned down to embers, and they sat in silence once more. Yet this silence was not like the first days of the road. It was less hostile, less uncertain. Both of them, in their own way, had begun to recognize that survival was no longer his alone or hers alone. It belonged to them together, whether they had chosen it or not. The land beyond the ridge unfolded into open plains, wide fields broken by patches of woodland and small villages clinging to the road. The cart rattled steadily as the girl hauled it, the leather straps cutting into her shoulders, though the makeshift harness Marcus had fashioned spared her from crawling as she had on the first day. Her steps were slow but upright now, and he kept close at her side, adjusting the cart when it pulled too sharply to one side. He no longer thought of her as a shadow trailing him. She was beside him, part of the journey. By midday, they reached a settlement where traders gathered near the road with sacks of grain and baskets of dried fish. The villagers' eyes followed them immediately. A soldier of Rome, tall and armed, and a slave girl in torn clothing bound to a cart. Whispers moved quickly through the crowd. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the judgment, the quiet disgust. To them it was not unusual for a slave to be treated harshly, but what unsettled them was the way he walked so near, sometimes steadying her arm, sometimes adjusting the rope for her comfort. They saw something unspoken between them and mistrusted it. The girl kept her gaze lowered, but she felt their eyes too, the shame pressing into her chest like a brand. Every step among those stairs reminded her of her place, property, object less than human. She waited for Marcus to order her aside, to remind her of the distance between them. Instead, when they reached the market stall, he looked at her once and said quietly, "Come." It was not a command barked at a slave, but a gesture, as if he had chosen not to leave her standing apart. The shopkeeper frowned at her presence, muttering under his breath, but Marcus met his gaze without wavering. No one challenged him further. Inside the stall, Marcus bought dried meat and a small jar of oil to stretch their rations. He counted the coins carefully, pay he had saved from years of service, meant to be spent sparingly. He noticed the girl watching him, not with greed, but with quiet curiosity. Slaves were rarely trusted with money, and she seemed startled to see a soldier treat silver with such care, as if every coin were worth more than the sword at his hip. For her, it revealed something. He was not careless, not one of the men who wasted everything because they could always demand more. That night, when they camped just beyond the village, the tension of the market still hung between them. She cooked their meal in silence, boiling grain with oil until it thickened into a porridge, while Marcus sat sharpening his blade. Finally, he broke the quiet. "They stare because I brought you inside," he said, his tone level, not apologetic. She looked at him quickly, unsure if he was blaming her. But then he added, "I don't care what they think." He did not explain further, but she understood enough. He had made a choice, not for her comfort, not for show, but because something in him no longer accepted leaving her outside. Later, when the fire burned low, he watched her thread a torn seam in her garment with a sliver of bone she had shaped into a needle. The detail struck him. The patience in her fingers, the quiet skill that spoke of years surviving with almost nothing. He thought of the questions that had gone unspoken since their journey began. What was her name? What family had she once known? Whether she still dreamed of returning home? But he did not ask. He feared the answers might be things neither of them could carry. Instead, he offered something else, something small but deliberate. Tomorrow we'll stop at the stream before midday. You'll wash. I'll wait. The words startled her. Slaves were rarely given such consideration. She searched his face for mockery, but found only the flat seriousness that marked everything he said. She lowered her eyes and gave the smallest nod. That night, for the first time, she slept without bracing for his voice to wake her in anger. At dawn, they continued. The straps cut at her shoulders, but she walked straighter now, her head no longer bent as low. Marcus carried the sword at his side, his other hand resting at times on the edge of the cart when the road grew rough. From a distance, they might have looked like soldier and servant, as they always had. But to anyone who watched more closely, there was something else, something subtle, unspoken, that made them pause. The soldier no longer looked like a man marching alone, and the girl no longer looked like someone who had been left voiceless. They moved together, not as equals, but no longer as strangers chained by duty alone. The road from the village bent toward the plain, and in the distance, the first outlines of the garrison walls began to emerge. The towers were small against the horizon, but to Marcus they were heavy with meaning. Duty completed, reports delivered, the safety of men he had sworn to support. To the girl, however, the sight stirred something else entirely: fear. She had lived long enough under Roman chains to know what awaited inside. The endless kitchens, the laundry pits, the nameless ranks of slaves who came and went without a trace. What they had shared on the road, however fragile, would dissolve the moment they crossed those gates. Marcus felt her pace slow, and he glanced at her without a word. Her shoulders sagged beneath the straps, though the cart was lighter now after he had traded some goods in the village. He considered urging her forward, but he could see it in her eyes, the hesitation, the dread of becoming invisible again. He recognized it because he carried a version of it himself. For him, the garrison meant orders, inspections, the endless cycle of obedience to men who gave little thought to the cost of their commands. They stopped at a bend in the road where a cluster of trees offered shade. Marcus gestured for her to rest, and she let the straps fall from her shoulders, the rope leaving deep red marks across her skin. She rubbed at them silently, her eyes never leaving the distant walls. He sat opposite her, pulling off his helmet and setting it in the dirt. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he asked, "Do you want to walk through those gates?" His tone was flat, but the question itself was startling. No soldier asked a slave what she wanted. She looked at him quickly, almost certain she had misheard. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Words did not come easily to her. Years of silence had taught her to swallow them. But now she forced herself to answer. "If I go in, I disappear." Her voice was raw, quiet, but steady. Marcus held her gaze. He could have told her it was not her choice, that her fate was already decided. But instead he remained silent, as if weighing something heavier than the cart they had dragged together. His mind returned to the nights on the road. The way she had sewn his sandals without being asked, the way she had endured without complaint, the way she had looked at the fields of the villagers with quiet grief. He thought, too, of his own years in the legions, the comrades buried nameless on foreign soil, the emptiness that had followed him since. He had always believed that duty left no room for hesitation, but here, with this woman kneeling in the dust, hesitation had become impossible to ignore. When they resumed walking, Marcus made a choice he did not speak aloud. As the gates of the garrison loomed larger, he did not position her behind him as other soldiers would have. He did not bind her wrists or force her into the line of slaves that usually trailed supply carts. Instead, he walked beside her, step for step. The cart followed behind, creaking under its weight, but for the first time, neither of them seemed to notice it. The guards at the entrance gave them curious looks. One opened his mouth to question why the girl was unbound, why she stood beside him instead of behind, but Marcus' hardened stare silenced him. He was a veteran, his face carved by campaigns, and his presence alone carried authority. They were waved through without further challenge. Inside, the noise of the garrison surrounded them. The clang of blacksmiths, the shouts of officers drilling men in the yard, the stench of smoke and sweat. The girl tensed, her breath quickening as she looked around. Marcus saw her body stiffen, saw the fear she could not hide. He leaned close enough that only she could hear. "You stay with me." The words were blunt, stripped of any softness, but to her they were more than she expected. That evening, when the supplies were finally unloaded and accounted for, Marcus did not send her to the slave quarters. Instead, he led her to the small lodgings assigned to soldiers of long service. The room was bare, a cot, a stool, a table, but it was clean and it was his. She stood just inside the doorway, uncertain, waiting for the command that would surely come. Marcus set his helmet on the table and turned to face her. For a long time he said nothing, only studying her as if trying to decide whether to speak at all. At last he said one word, the same word he had spoken once before, but this time heavier, deliberate. "Stay." For the first time since the horse had fallen on the road, she felt her body ease. The fear of vanishing into anonymity loosened its grip, replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: choice. She nodded once, slowly, and stepped further into the room. The garrison settled into its usual rhythm as night fell. Soldiers laughed and drank in the courtyard. Slaves hurried between kitchens and storerooms, and the clang of iron from the smithy rang out even after sunset. In Marcus' quarters, however, there was quiet. The girl stood by the doorway as though rooted to the spot, her eyes moving cautiously over the cot, the jug of water, the bare wooden table. It was the first time in years she had entered a soldier's lodging not as a servant, but as someone asked to remain. The difference unsettled her. Marcus removed his armor piece by piece, setting the breastplate carefully against the wall. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the weight he laid aside was more than metal. He looked at her then, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she seemed ready to be sent away at any moment. He realized that silence, once a shield for both of them, was now a burden. He pulled out the stool and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, unsure if it was truly meant for her, but when he did not move, she lowered herself carefully onto it. For a long moment, he studied her scars, her thin frame, the rope marks still raw on her skin. He thought of the first day, the horse dying on the road, how she had dropped to her knees and pulled the cart without being asked. He thought of how she had endured without complaint, how she had mended his sandals, how she had carried burdens that would have broken many men. He knew the garrison would see her as nothing but property, yet he could no longer see her that way. He poured water from the jug into a cup and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, surprised again that he gave it to her before drinking himself. When she met his eyes, she found no mockery, no impatience, only a guarded steadiness. It was then that he spoke more than he ever had on the road. "My name is Marcus Aelius Vero. I served 15 years in the legions. I buried comrades in Germania, Pannonia, Judea. I thought I had nothing left except orders to follow." His voice was flat, but the truth in it carried weight. "And yet, here you are. You pulled more than a cart. You pulled me through it." The words stunned her. No soldier had ever spoken to her in that way. Not as an object, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. For the first time, she dared to answer with more than a few words. Her voice shook, but she forced it out. "I was taken when I was 10. I had a name once. It was Livia. They burned my village. I survived because I kept silent." Her eyes lowered, expecting his disinterest, but Marcus did not look away. He nodded once, as if committing the name to memory. "Livia," he said firmly, as though sealing it back into the world. The night passed without command, without fear. She slept on the cot, while Marcus rested against the wall, sword across his knees. When dawn came, she awoke to find him still there, watching quietly, his expression calmer than she had ever seen it. For her, the fear of vanishing into the faceless crowd of slaves was gone. For him, the emptiness of being nothing more than a soldier obeying orders had shifted. They were no longer alone in their silence. That morning, Marcus made his decision plain. He reported the delivery of the supplies, signed his name on the records, And when asked about the girl, he gave no explanation beyond, "She is with me." The officer raised an eyebrow, but did not press further. Marcus had served too long and carried too much weight in his voice to be questioned. From that moment, Livia was not assigned to the kitchens or the laundry. She remained in his quarters, not hidden, not chained, but recognized by his presence at her side. In the days that followed, a new rhythm formed. She cooked their meals, not because she was ordered but because she chose to. He shared his rations evenly, sometimes giving her the larger portion. At night, they sat in silence as before, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without needing words. The cart, once a crushing burden, became only a memory, a symbol of the road that had bound them together. When weeks passed, and he was granted leave from service, Marcus stood at the edge of the garrison with his pack on his shoulder. Livia stood beside him, unbound, no longer shrinking beneath stares. He turned to her and spoke the word that had carried them through from the start. "Stay." But this time it was not an order, not even a plea. It was a choice he offered. She answered not with silence, but with a clear, steady voice. "I will." Together they walked beyond the walls, leaving behind the noise of the garrison, the weight of the road, and the chains of the past. The journey that had begun with loss ended with something neither had expected: companionship, trust, and the fragile beginning of a life no longer carried alone.